Thank you, Sonia. Like so many of you, I have a cell phone, and Caroline has a cell phone. We have both had them for a long time. I'm glad that Caroline has a cell phone because even though she's a stay-at-home mom with our 4 kids and homeschools them, and though it's true that most of the time if you need to reach her, you can do so by calling the landline, calling our home phone. We don't live, and she doesn't live in a prison, though oftentimes it feels that way, and she does get to leave periodically. And so when she does, I appreciate if she needs to get a hold of me or call somebody else, or if I need to get a hold of her, that she's got this cell phone that I might be able to reach her with. That being said, I really believe that we would just as well be equally served with Caroline having a cell phone as in having 2 soup cans with some string tied between them. And that's the honest truth, because Caroline's batteries are never charged. That phone is always dead. And I ought to nickname her phone Lazarus, but Lazarus came back to life. Anyway, this one stays dead all the time. And it's frustrating, it's aggravating. Sometimes, though, it's of little consequence. And most of the time how it works is that she's out and about, and I'll think of something. Maybe she's at the store. I want her to add this to her list. I'll try to get her, and all I get is voicemail. And so she'll show back a short time later at home, and I'll say, hey, I tried to call you, 19 times, and all I got was voicemail. And she'll say, oh, yeah, I'm so sorry, my phone battery was dead. And so I've heard that so many times. In other circumstances, though, the consequences are a bit greater, and the nature of it is more intense. A few weeks ago, Caroline had one night gone with Nathan to a store, and while they were out, and still to this day, we don't know exactly what was going on, but all of a sudden she said, I felt like my heart began to race, and I couldn't focus on things. And like my vision all of a sudden became blurry, and it was like that for a period of minutes. And then as strangely as it came on, it just kind of stopped. And so she calls me to say, hey, this is going on. I think that I'm okay. I'm going to be heading home now, but I just want you to know that this is going on. So that happens on like a Tuesday night. And so we get home, or she gets home, and we talk about it and think, maybe this is a fluke. And so we go to bed that night, and she's fine going to bed. She's fine when she wakes up. I'm fine the next morning. So I come to church, and the morning begins, and everything is fine. But then she calls me and says, this episode that happened last night, it just happened again. And so I said, look, why don't you go ahead and call the doctor? She calls the doctor, and he says, why don't you go ahead and go to urgent care? And so she says that he wants me to go there. And I said, well, I'll leave the church. I'll come home and stay with the kids so that you can go to the doctor's office. And so that's what happens. As soon as I get home, she heads out the door and goes to urgent care. While she's there, this period of time has passed since she has been gone. And I'm beginning to wonder, have they seen her? Is everything okay? I think I'm going to just call and check in. Ring, ring, ring. Voicemail. I thought, well, maybe it's a signal problem. Maybe she's in a part of the building where she can't get a signal. And so I try, 9 or 10,000 more times, and I still get her voicemail. And I think, well, okay, the battery's dead. And some more time passes, and I'm really beginning to wonder. And when those thoughts start, it's like a train, and it's tough to stop them. Because at first I'm thinking, well, a lot of times at urgent care, half of Greensboro is there, and you've got to wait to be seen. And unless your jugular has been cut, you're going to contract some venereal disease out in the waiting room with everybody else that's in there. I don't know where that came from. That one was free. But enough time has passed, though, that I feel like she ought to have been seen. We ought to be getting some word back, and I can't reach her. And I'm beginning to get concerned, and I'm thinking, well, might this episode have occurred there, and they put her on an ambulance and sent her to the hospital? And what if she's there and just can't reach me, or can't tell them or remember what our number is to call? And so these thoughts are starting to go through my mind. I'm beginning to get anxious about all of this. And about that time, our home phone rings, and it's Caroline. And she's calling from the landline there in the doctor's office. And she is explaining and apologetic. She said, I'm so sorry. She said, everything's okay. I'm just waiting at this point to be seen. Everything's okay, but my phone battery is dead. Caroline's phone battery seems to always be dead. Why? Because it so rarely gets charged. We began a series a few weeks ago that I've entitled When the Fizz is Gone. And what we've been talking about how it's so easy for this to happen, especially the longer that you have a relationship with God, that things can go from positions or experiences of vitality and strength and enthusiasm, and in time that can wane so that you kind of feel like your walk with God is a lot like a box of stale crackers, like a flat Coke, kind of like Caroline's phone battery. It's just dead. Well, if you recognize, and if you're here this morning and as I'm painting that picture, you begin to think, well, hey, that describes me in my relationship with the Lord. I wish it weren't that way. I lament the fact and I rue the fact that it is that way. I'd like for it to change. I'd like to have zeal and enthusiasm and pep and passion and intimacy and all these things in my walk with God. Well, you recognize for you to experience that, some things are going to have to change. And for them to change, you've got to understand, and not simply understand, but to begin and practice some principles that God, through the Apostle Paul, communicated in the 6th chapter of Galatians. So what is it that God wants us to know and practice so that we can get the fizz back, so that we can maintain the fizz? Well, again, Paul answers that in Galatians chapter 6. If you would get your Bible or grab one in front of you in the pew rack and turn with me to Galatians chapter 6, and we'll begin reading with verse 7. Galatians chapter 6, starting with verse 7. Galatians 6, verse 7, Paul says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. He who sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. But see, he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. Let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart." In 3 verses, Paul communicates 3 principles that are at work. And if you want to use these principles to your advantage, what you can come to experience is the fizz coming back and the fizz being maintained. So what are the principles that God, through Paul, is communicating? The first is this: you reap when you sow. You reap when you sow. This is a passage that you probably are familiar with. If you've been in church for any length of time, you have heard this passage before, hopefully have read it before. If you watch any religious broadcasting on TV, it's a passage that you hear a lot. A lot of TV preachers you will hear use this particular passage, and many of them using it in damaging, destructive, and I would argue even in heretical ways. You could, for example, this afternoon listen to Benny Hinn or Kenneth Copeland or Rod Parsley, and you may very well hear them use this particular passage. And how they'll use it is to communicate a truth, or actually a lie, that says something like this: what you need to do is to take your seed, which typically your seed is $1,000, and sow it, they'll say, into the fertile soil of this ministry. And once you have sown that seed, water that seed monthly, sprinkle a little bit more money on it, and then in due season you will reap a harvest, and the harvest is thousands and tens of thousands of dollars. Let me be emphatically clear. That is exactly the opposite of what God is saying. God is not, through Paul, talking about sowing dollars and cents to reap $100 bills. That's not what God is talking about. These preachers are talking about it, but it's a lie. It's a heresy. That's not what this says. Well, if that's not what it says, what does it say? Well, he starts in verse 7 with a warning. He says, "Do not be deceived." If we were to use our more personal way, less formal way of communication, speaking in our own vernacular, we would say, listen, don't be tricked, don't be fooled, don't kid yourself. Well, don't be tricked or fooled, don't kid yourself about what? He says, first of all, that God is not mocked. God is not mocked. The word that's used there in Greek that's translated as mocked in English is a term that means this: to be made to look foolish by being outwitted. So Paul is saying of God, God is not going to be made to look foolish by being outwitted. So don't kid yourself. Don't deceive yourself. Well, how is it that God is not going to be outwitted and made to be look foolish by us? Because, he says, there's a principle in operation. There's this principle at work in the various aspects of your life, and you see it at the end of verse 7. Very simply, whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. Whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. Now, again, this is not for most of us an unfamiliar, completely new passage or text for us. You have heard this, some of you, many times before. You've heard it in sermons and Sunday school lessons. You have read it in personal Bible study. You're familiar with this. And most of the time when we hear this passage being dealt with, and in fact that particular principle, whatever a man sows, that he will also reap, we hear it in thinking about kind for kind, that the harvest has a direct relation to the nature of the seed that's planted. And that's exactly true, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But in zeroing in on that thought, I believe that we can very easily miss a more basic, but still altogether essential thought, an essential principle, which is this. You reap a harvest when you sow seed. When you do not sow, you do not reap. Very simple, but altogether important. Let me see if I can paint the picture for you this way. This past summer, June, July, August, half of September, every time I went into my backyard, and if I had really thought about it, perhaps I was disappointed. I didn't get this year one single green bean out of my backyard. I didn't get one ear of corn. Not one single cucumber. Not one eggplant. For that, I'm grateful. But not one ear of corn, not one cantaloupe, not one tomato from my backyard. Why? I didn't plant any of those things. I didn't get any corn because I didn't plant any corn. I didn't get any beans because I planted no beans. I got no peppers because I planted not a single pepper. Paul is trying to say here, first of all, that you reap only when it is that you sow. If you are sowing nothing, you are consequently going to be reaping nothing. Well, take that thought and evaluate it through the lens of your walk with God. And it may feel for you right now, and you may, if you're honest before God, you may not tell those around you, you may not tell me, but in your mind and in your heart, you know, right now it feels like you are coasting spiritually on fumes. The tank is empty, and fumes are all that's left. There's no vitality, there's no freshness, no intimacy, no zeal, no passion. Everything is flat and lifeless. For the majority of people, perhaps even for you, do you recognize why that may be the case? Now, it's not that you enjoy or relish how things are. You want intimacy, you want freshness, you want enthusiasm. That's the harvest that in the depths of your heart you would love to reap. That's the experience that you want to have. But you never get it. Or at least these days you're not getting it. Why? Well, because for too many people, perhaps even for you, you're not sowing anything. You're not sowing anything. You want all of these things. That's the harvest that you want to experience. But in advance of gaining that harvest, you plant absolutely nothing. You spend no time talking to God in prayer, never cracking your Bible open to see what God has already said about Himself and about you and about the circumstances of our world. You're not investing whatsoever. Zero, zilch, nada. Squat in your walk with God. And then strangely, it comes to us as a surprise that things are just kind of flatlined. After all, we don't want that. We want something better. We want the zeal, the enthusiasm. We want the fizz, the pop, the life, the vitality. We want all of that. That's the harvest that we want to experience. And it seems that we come away oftentimes surprised that we don't experience it, when in fact we're planting, we're sowing nothing. Nothing. My encouragement for you is to think with the end in view. If vitality and freshness and fizz is what you want, you got to ask yourself, well, if that's the harvest, there's a seed that's got to be planted to generate that type of response. This is, as I said earlier, a principle that is at work. Principles are not, and we talked about this on Wednesday nights, or this past Wednesday night, principles are not laws or rules, because laws and rules can be broken. Principles are at work whether you are aware of them or not, whether you agree with them or not, whether you like them or not. They just simply are. And God, through Paul, is saying this is how it is, that you reap when you sow. And when you do not sow, you do not reap. And if your walk with God is flat and dull and lifeless, answer yourself in your heart this morning this question before God: am I sowing anything? Am I sowing anything? That's the first principle. You reap when you sow. But then Paul communicates another one, which is this: you reap according to what you sow. You reap according to what you sow. All right, so he says, don't be deceived. God's not mocked. He's not made to look foolish by being outwitted, because there's this principle at stake. And he says, whatever or whatsoever a man sows, that he will also reap. Now, this you're probably more familiar with, because it's the expression, the thought of kind for kind. For example, when I was little, we always had a garden in the summer. We always had a pretty sizable garden. My dad they would plant all kinds of stuff. We had lima beans and green beans. We had okra, squash, cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers, watermelon, cantaloupe. We had all kinds of stuff. Pretty big garden. And to the extent that it was possible when I was of these various ages, I would help in the process. So as my dad is out there with a tiller, I would be out there with him, really just getting in the way. But I would try to help him, and as he's plowing the ground and generating the rows and planting the seed, then I would help when it came time to pick or pull these various fruits and vegetables. And that being said, I decided finally I want to have some skin in the game. I want some action in this garden for myself. And so I told my dad, listen, I'd like to have something that I can plant myself. And so when it came time to plant that year, I went with him to this little hardware store where he would buy his seeds and plants. And he points me over to this carousel that has dozens of different little envelopes of various types of vegetables. And finally, I settled on a little envelope of radish seeds. And I was so excited about all of this. And my dad buys them for me, and we get back home, and he gives me the front row of the garden, the very first row. And so the row is already in place, and all I've got to do is just kind of break the top open, and I put a whole row of my seeds down. I cover them up as my dad is finishing planting the rest of the garden. And so at that point, the days and the weeks pass. The garden is watered both through a hose and through the rain. It's fertilized. We go out there and we're pulling weeds and making sure that we're tending all of this. And finally, after some weeks have passed, I see some little leaves just sprouting out of the ground in that first row of radishes that I've planted. It's clear, and I'm excited. My seeds have germinated, and I'm growing radishes. After some weeks passed, finally I decided this is the appropriate time to begin to pull these things. And so I go into our shed, and I get a kind of a small bucket, and I begin to pull them. And very quickly, I fill that bucket up, and I go to get a 5-gallon bucket, and I more than fill that up. I've got 8, 9 gallons worth of radishes. And do you know how many of those radishes I ate? 0. Why? I hate radishes. I really do. I don't think they taste good. I think radishes are bad. If you give me a salad that's got radishes in it, I'm going to pick around them. They're going to still be there when I finish with that salad. I do not like radishes. And to this day, when I think about that, I ask myself, as you're perhaps asking this, why did you plant radishes? I don't know. Why didn't I plant carrots? I like carrots. But I didn't like radishes. I don't like radishes, and yet that's what I planted. But because that's what I planted, that's what I got, whether I liked it or not. What you sow is going to determine the nature of the harvest. If you sow beans, you will get beans. If you sow corn, you will get corn. If you sow squash, you will get squash. That's what Paul is saying here. When you look at your life, you are aware of the fact that everything in both the physical realm and the spiritual realm, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. There is cause and there is effect. My question for you today is, what type of effect, what type of reaction, what type of harvest is it that you are experiencing? More specifically, in the spiritual realm, do you see God working and doing anything of consequence spiritually? I mean, do you see God doing anything of note in your life? Well, if you're sowing the seeds of spiritual apathy, where God and His Word and spending time with Him, where giving yourself enough quiet to be able to hear from Him, where pursuing Him and pursuing intimacy with God, if that's not on your radar screen, why in the world would you expect intimacy to be the harvest? Why in the world would you think zeal would be the harvest? Why in the world would you think fizz and passion and enthusiasm and spunk and life and vitality? Why in the world would you expect to get that type of harvest when all you're sowing are the seeds of apathy and indifference? Because it doesn't work that way. Again, this is a principle at stake. You reap according to what you sow. If you're sowing nothing, you're reaping nothing. If you are sowing apathy, you will reap indifference. And if you are experiencing a flatlined walk with God, if the fizz feels genuinely as though it is gone, odds are, in fact, I'm willing to bet everything I've got on the fact that you're experiencing that because of what you're sowing. After all, you reap according to what you sow. There's a final principle that Paul communicates here, which is this: you reap after you sow. You reap after you sow. In verse 9, Paul completes the thought by tacking on a further admonition. He says, and he cautions against growing weary, which is tired, fatigued, burned out, while doing good. For in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. If you have known the Lord for any length of time, you're able to look back and evaluate and look at your own walk with God. But also, if you've paid enough attention, you can see what has happened in the lives of others around you. And you have probably, over the years, noted somebody that God really got a hold of and did an amazing work in their life. You know, prior to them coming to faith in Christ, this is somebody that was absolutely headed in the wrong direction, and their life seemed to be a domino effect of one bad decision after the other, after the other, after the other, and their life was an absolute train wreck. And then they came to discover that God loved them and that Jesus died for them, and they respond to God through faith. And God saves them, and they have this new relationship with Christ, and everything's different. And you can see it's the difference between night and day. A phenomenal turnaround in their life. And this person who before had no interest in spiritual things seems to have a spiritual appetite that can't be quenched. I mean, every time the church doors are open, they are there. Every time there's an opportunity to serve, they're the first to sign up. This is somebody that doesn't just have a Bible with them on Sunday morning, but this is somebody that's wearing it out during the week. This is not somebody who simply says the blessing at mealtime. This is somebody that's talking to God while they're in the car, and when they pursue quiet time away from everybody else, just they and the Lord. And you have witnessed this type of person. As you have witnessed these types of people, you have probably noted more than a few that in time things kind of changed. The passion seemed to cool off. The enthusiasm seemed to get tempered. The service becomes more infrequent. The zeal seems to lose its existence. And things just kind of get flat. This person that used to be so phenomenally faithful, that was there every time the church doors were open, at best now, they show up sometimes or a lot of the times, not for anything else, but just for a Sunday morning worship service. This person whose conversations with strangers was regularly peppered with the gospel, they can't seem to find the thought to even mention Jesus anymore. This person that used to spend so much time talking to God in prayer gets to the point where, the blessing is about the only time they ever call on God's name. And everything has become flat and dull and lifeless. The fizz very much is gone. The question I'd have you think about is this: why for too many people has that and does that happen? Why is it that they seem to grow so weary in doing good? And man, they were doing good and they were doing so for a season of time, perhaps even years on end, but it just seems like the steam has gone away. The gas tank is empty. Why for so many has this been the case? Well, I believe for more than a few, it's because they have not heeded Paul's warning here, that they have emphatically grown weary in doing good. We need to recognize and be honest about the fact that living in ways that please God, that is not the path of least resistance. It's the path that's most difficult, because living a life of discipline and commitment, man, that's not easy. I mean, constantly you're having to set aside your personal will. Constantly you're having to go upstream against the path and the current of culture. It is very difficult. Living a life of discipline and commitment just gets tiring. And so many give up because they think to themselves, it's just not really doing any good. I'm not seeing really any fruit from it. I was doing this for a while, and I didn't see anything happen, or at least happen very quickly. Over the years, I have ordered a ton of things through the internet. I mean, a ton of stuff, a variety of different things. I've ordered pants and shirts and shoes and belts. I have ordered knives, and I've ordered tools. I've ordered office supplies. I've ordered electronics, camera stuff. Virtually every material aspect of my life, I have ordered something in that particular category online. And I have done so, and those of you who have also ordered things online, you have done so probably for one ultimate reason, which is this: if you can find what you want on the internet, odds are you're going to find it cheaper, and oftentimes significantly cheaper over what you would spend at a brick and mortar store. And so I have saved over the years, I don't know, I'm sure multiplied thousands of dollars, because I would go to Amazon, I'd go to some other website, and I would order what it is that I want through them. So consequently, I've got a lot more money in my pocket than I would have had, because I've taken advantage of the internet. That being said, there are a lot of things that I could have ordered on the internet that I didn't. I mean, there's electronics, there's clothes, there's shoes, there's all kinds of things that I could have ordered on the internet that I didn't. Tons of money that I could have saved, but I didn't. Well, why didn't I order it? Well, you understand how that process works. First of all, you have to figure out what it is that you want on the internet from a very particular website. You order it, and you key in all the information, so that you submit the order. The order then has to be processed. They got to get it off the shelf, get it packaged, get it in a box, get a label on it. They've got to get it to the carrier. The carrier has to then travel to get it to you, and then finally it's delivered. And so from the time that you order until the time that you receive, days pass. And so there are so many instances where I could have saved significant amounts of money, but I wound up instead going over to Walmart or going over to Best Buy and getting it today and paying more, missing out on that savings. Why? Because I just didn't want to wait. I didn't want to wait. Ours is a society and a culture very much of immediate gratification, isn't it? I mean, we want instantaneous things. We want very quick, rapid turnaround, instant lab results. We want 1 hour photo developing on the slow end. We want to show up and not have to wait in line behind anybody at the bank or at the store. We want everything as quick as absolutely possible. We are not people that like to wait. We absolutely hate and avoid at all cost waiting. And oftentimes, if we cannot get what it is that we want and get it now, we just move on to something else. Too many people have allowed that same line of thinking to affect their walk with Christ. They might quit sharing because they haven't seen decisions made. They might quit studying because it doesn't seem that the heavens have opened up and new insight has just dumped into their minds. We get tired from and we get weary from doing good. And for many, the good seems to wane because they're not seeing results, or they're not seeing them as quickly as they would have hoped or liked. That's why Paul is warning us against this. Notice what he says. Let us not grow weary while doing good, because we're going to get a harvest. When? He says, in due season, we're going to reap if we don't lose heart, if we don't give up. I'm sure more than a few of you have gardens, or this coming spring and summer, you're going to be having a garden. And over the years, you've been out in the fields a lot in your life, and you understand how all this works. How many of you have ever gone out one day and planted green beans, and the next day you were canning? How many of you went out one day and planted a tomato plant, and the next day for lunch you were having a BLT? Well, that hasn't happened. It hasn't happened for any of us. It's not going to happen for any of us. Why? Because you have to wait. You plant, you sow, and then time has to pass. And then finally it gets to due season, whatever that is, and finally you're able to experience a harvest. Some of you, perhaps in days, weeks, or months gone by, years gone by, you were doing the right things. You were sowing the good seed, doing the positive and the right. But then in time you just kind of lax. Perhaps because it's just not easy and you just got tired. Maybe it was because you were looking at others that weren't living up to that same measure of discipline and commitment, and you thought, well, God's not zapping them with a lightning bolt. They seem to be doing okay, so I'm going to opt more for the path of least resistance. Perhaps it was because you did not, however, by virtue of your work and your sacrifice and your commitment, you just were not seeing immediate results. And so you just slack off. You get lax. You quit watering and fertilizing those seeds. And do you know what has happened? What has happened is that there are harvests that you could have received that you have not and you will not because you just stopped. You just stopped. There's a harvest that could have been yours, results that could have been yours, but you have not and you will not experience because you just gave up. You, as Paul said, you just lost heart. There are people that could have been won if you had kept sharing. There are insights that could have been gleaned if you had just kept studying. Paul's admonition, my admonition, but far more importantly, God's admonition is this: sow the good seed and keep at it. Don't give up. Do not slow down, because you will experience and you will reap a harvest, but you're going to have to wait. What I described at the outset, you may say, Michael, that's me. Dull, flat, lifeless. Like a dead battery. My walk with God feels just like that. You recognize that. Hopefully also you understand what it is that we've talked about this morning. That there's probably a cause, and there is a cause for that. Maybe it's because of that first principle. You reap when you sow, and you haven't been sowing anything. That you reap in keeping with the kind of what you plant. And what you've been sowing is indifference and apathy, and that's what you've been getting. Or maybe it's because you just kind of took your foot off the gas. You were looking for a harvest, you wanted a harvest, and it wasn't coming quick enough, so you just kind of just plopped down on the pew and said, okay, that's it. Are you okay with that? I want you to know God's not. He doesn't want that for you. Flat, dull, lifeless walks with Him, that's not what He wants for you. The question is, do you want that for yourself? Are you okay with things being flat? Or are you ready to make a decision? These principles that are in my mind, I'm going to get them in my heart. Some things are going to change, and change starting today. Won't you bow your heads with me?